We are just about to start the next session. And therefore, I would like to ask you to start taking your seats so that we can start the next session, which is Focus Area 1, Subtopic 3, Digital Sovereignty. Is Europe going in the right direction to keep internet infrastructure secure and open? I would like to take the opportunity to introduce the moderator of the next session, David Frautzi. Please, take over the session and start your moderation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
So sorry for everybody because I cannot be present in Trieste. My flight was cancelled yesterday morning. There was a strike on the Brussels airport. So I'm going to miss the personal contact, which is one of the highlights of these meetings. Well, it's not a surprise to see the interest on the topic of digital sovereignty on this EuroDIG. Policymakers cannot take for granted that everyone gives the concept the same meaning. As we have already seen in the previous sessions, there are discussions about what this really is about. So I think this would be a very first critical step, defining what we are talking about, and more importantly, what are the objectives. Otherwise, we could get in trouble and we might be harming the internet. So I hope the discussions today and tomorrow will help identify this issue clearly. And in this panel, we want to answer to the following question. Is Europe going in the right direction to keep the internet infrastructure secure and open? Because digital sovereignty often manifests measures and policies that either target or involve the internet. And some could affect how the internet works. At the Internet Society, we are worried or we are concerned about this trend, and we are currently working on digital sovereignty plays out in different regions of the world. And we want to develop a position with a community, and we want to provide a foundation for future analysis rooted in what my colleague Callum mentioned in the previous panel, our Internet Impact Assessment framework. So this trend is not only happening in Europe, of course, it is happening in other jurisdictions with other, we could call other flavors, right? Or other policy objectives. We see governments trying to impose geographic borders to something that does not have borders, which is the global internet. So how will this affect the infrastructure, and what should we be saying and doing about it? So as I said, we are developing a position, and these panels today at EuroDIG are a great input for the work that we are developing at the Internet Society. So for the time, I will present the speakers and I will immediately give them the floor. We have Andrea Garcia Rodriguez from the Brussels-based think tank European Policy Center. We have Florence Xell from SciencePo. She's the chair of Digital Governance and Sovereignty. We have Johannes Tunfart from the Brussels University. And finally, we have Jaromír Novak, who is advisor to the Czech Minister of Industry and Trade. And I think we have a mixed composition of panelists, given, as I said, think tanks and university representatives, and also a European member state representative who can give the views of policymakers. So with no further delay, please, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, David, for this opportunity for being a speaker in this panel, and thank you very much for everyone interested. I wish I could be there with you. Who doesn't want to be in Italy right now? My idea is to give you a few points of discussion, because obviously I'm surrounded by a very good panel today, and I don't want to take much of the time. And plus, I would rather see this opportunity to speak as an opportunity to provide food for thought, because this is the best thing about conferences, to have this input. And in that sense, I would like to focus my presentation in one topic that I think is often overlooked, which is Europe's strategic autonomy, digital strategic autonomy in the global context. Meaning that where are we going when it comes to the internet and governance of cyberspace, and what are the key elements that we should disguise, and what is Europe doing to react to this, and how we can place Europe's strategy within this global tendency. So in that sense, I would like to start with something rather controversial, which is a differentiation between digital strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty. Of course, both terms have become in Brussels interchangeable in the sense that when you go to a conference, a meeting, or wherever you go and you want to discuss this topic, people will use digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy as the same topic, which is obviously something that makes all the sense. If we think about it, during the past few years, we have seen a tendency of growing interest by the European institutions, especially during the French presidency and before that, of creating this sense of in-betweenness between Europe and the rest of the world when it comes to digital infrastructure, but also when it comes to the development of new technology. So in that sense, my first point here that I want to give to you is that both terms, although there's like some nuances, we have been using them because the sole goal of strategic autonomy is to do two things. The first thing is fill the gaps, and I think that in Europe we have been lagging behind on so many key issues that we're like nowadays trying to notice. And the second thing is building bridges. And I think this metaphor is really useful right now because it like helps us understand the need of the European institutions, but also like European public administrations at the national level, regional level, government level, to create these bridges between not only academia and public sector, because we need to understand that sometimes this is not something that happens easily. So academia needs to be able to provide its research insights so they can be included in policy, and policy makers should help academics to drive the direction of their research. And then the second bridge will be between the public sector and the private sector. And in that sense, we need a public sector that is like strengthened in the sense that it's able to provide a strategic insight when it comes to what are the key priorities in cyberspace, not only when it comes to governance, but also, which I think is the perfect topic for this panel discussion, when it comes to building up digital infrastructure. Because even though digital looks very virtual, we all know in this room that that is not the case. We need infrastructure and we need to keep up on this infrastructure path because there's like lots of differences between Europe in itself in so many areas, starting from like fiber optic coverage to like telecommunications or 4G, 5G. So I think that in order to provide another controversial topic, that the direction European digital policy has been going, it's more focused on filling the gaps than in building the bridges. And although we have seen this tendency towards building bridges in the past like 2-3 years, I think that Europe must strive, especially in the second half of this European Commission mandate, because we just like turned this like this month has been like the midterm commission, so we have like tons of review. In that sense, Europe needs to strive and needs to do a dual digital policy now. The first half of that digital policy, the first hand of that should be keep filling the gaps, but on the other hand, it must take this anticipatory governance of new technologies, and it should like take this approach. So in this sense, I think this idea of like keeping the EU digital policy dual, it's perfectly convenient for what we understand as of now of strategic autonomy. The current debate, it's around open strategic autonomy, which is something that the Commission has labeled as the ability to act autonomously, to rely on one's own resources in key strategic areas, and to cooperate with partners. And here comes the important time, like the important phrase, whenever needed. So that means that we need to strive to be autonomous, but we acknowledge that we cannot do everything ourselves. Therefore, we need to look for strategic partnerships. And we are still trying to decide what these strategic partnerships are. So far, we have been having these partnerships within the typical forum or within our typical allies. Let it be Canada, let it be the United States. And that's the reason we have the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council. But we must not forget that we have a Trade and Technology Council upcoming with India, and the EU is negotiating a free trade agreement with India as well. And there's like digital partnerships coming with Asian countries, such as Japan, that has been recently signed, South Korea, or many others. So in that sense, I think that my second point I would like to bring to the table is exactly that. Like, how do we convert EU's digital policy into a dual digital policy that takes into account like these both items of strategic autonomy, bridges and gaps? But of course, in proposing this, there will be always tension. And I think that if we see Europe's quest for strategic autonomy in the global sense, we see that it oftentimes can be reactive because of two things. The first one is the growing geopolitical tensions that have been affecting Europe for the past few years. We can see, of course, like the tensions with China, but also with the United States, especially within the context of the Trump presidency. And then the second one is digital disruption. That I understand this of course, this topic has like many nuances, and we can discuss later. But I understand it as how technology impacts fundamental rights and challenge our economic models. And I think that focusing on the economy here can be really useful, because therefore we can understand the emergence of, for example, the platform economy. So how can we deal with these two things, with geopolitical tensions and with digital disruption? So in that sense, if we look outside of Europe, we will see that Europe is not the only bloc or country taken into these steps forward. Unfortunately, we're living in an era in which digital freedoms and digital rights have been undermined. And I'm referring especially to two tendencies. The first one is digital protectionism. And the second one is digital sovereignty, cyber sovereignty often dubbed, which is represented by the Chinese model, and that China has been trying to advance in several international institutions, not only the United Nations, but other forums that it has itself created. So just to bring you a definition that China is using, and this definition is from 2017, which is from ages ago, we think in digital terms. When we speak about cyber sovereignty, we tend to speak about how do we translate the principle of sovereignty from our physical domain to the digital domain. And enhancing this very dangerous approach to cyberspace governance would help countries exercise a tighter control of what happens within. Specifically, and I'm literally reading, countries should respect each other's right to choose their own path of cyber development, model of cyber regulation and internet public policies, and participate in international cyberspace governance on an equal footing. No country should pursue cyber hegemony, interfere in other countries' international affairs, or engage in, condone, or support cyber activities that undermine countries' national security. So, of course, when we're speaking about this might look a little bit tempting, but if we think about it, what we're basically saying is that, okay, if we pursue this path, then what is the role of civil society? How can we, for example, dissent, right? If every country has a right to exercise full control over everything happening within, what are the safeguards that we need to build in order to protect internet freedoms? And I think that if we think about it, like, can this happen? Like, why is this a trend, and why are we speaking about this? Well, the first of all is that we are seeing an increasingly complex cyber threat landscape, and that is allowing countries, and I'm not speaking about China right now, but for example, Russia, to tighten the grip around cyberspace. Russia's internet sovereign law that came into force in 2019 is built around this idea that is increasingly being targeted by foreign actors vis-a-vis the United States, or it could be the European Union, and therefore they need to exercise a tighter control over the digital infrastructure, so to avoid negative consequences for malicious cyber activities. So that's one of the reasons that I think that we're going that way. And the second one is that we should not forget that incidents such as the Russian aggression against Ukraine provide a window of opportunity for countries that are doubting on which model to follow. And I think that is one of the reasons. Yes, I would just
because otherwise we won't have time for you. Are answering all the questions.
I'm in the conclusion already. Yeah, don't worry, I'm in the conclusion. So what I wanted to say is that we need to be vigilant with the windows of opportunities. And in that sense, here's my last two questions that I would like to ask the audience. First one, what is your strategic autonomy role vis-a-vis this tendency? And the second one, is there a way to endorse strategic autonomy in line of the foundational spirit of openness and digital freedom? I will give you the floor back, David, and I'm sorry if I overcome my time, but I think it's 5 minutes straight.
Yeah, you won't have, you're putting the questions already on the table, so that could never. So I'm giving the floor immediately to Florence so she can make her intervention. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for having me. I have prepared a few slides that I want to show you. Is it possible for me to show them?
I think you are allowed, yeah.
Okay. Okay, can you see them?
Yes, only half of it. Oh, now it's fine.
Is it okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so Andrea has said much on the topic and on the question that is very important for me as an academic and as a law professor, which is to determine what digital sovereignty means, provided that we already know the term of sovereignty, and the term of sovereignty refers to the state, and especially the state's authority, and more specifically, the state's authority over a territory. So as a jurist, the main question that I have, of course, is how can the state have authority over the virtual world? So we know today that it is possible to regulate somehow the virtual world, but we still have issues when we try to really define this expression, this term, digital sovereignty. And it is all the more difficult that we also have other expressions that we use, like technological sovereignty, like data sovereignty, and we realize that those expressions refer not only to the state's authority, but also to other kind of ideas, like the fact that we are dependent on foreign companies, on foreign nations, the fact that we have difficulties to control data flows and to protect personal data. And this is the reason why I would say that this expression of digital sovereignty actually refers to a double concern, to two concerns. First, the fact that there is a very strong influence of non-EU tech companies that, of course, threatens, for example, the EU citizen control over their personal data. This is what we call the surveillance capitalism, which constrains the growth of EU tech companies, and which also restricts the ability of the EU, of the member states to enforce their laws, which is really problematic because we know that the global tech companies do not always respect European rules and or fundamental values. So this is, of course, a huge issue, but this is an issue that must be combined with another concern and with another problem, which is the fact that we are, to a certain extent, dependent on foreign technology. We know it, and this dependence exists everywhere, in the field of AI, in the field of cloud computing, is in the field of 5G infrastructure. And of course, we are currently trying to overcome this situation, given the fact that we don't have the same possibilities as others. We know that the US and China invest massively in AI, and we, of course, don't have the same means. So since the question was about the EU, we know that the EU has been taking action over the past years to narrow the investment gap, to make data protected, effective within the EU. The EU has started various initiatives to adapt the industrial and tech capacity to the new environment, and especially regarding data, regarding AI. There were calls to build a European cloud, and there was this initiative called Gaia-X, that was launched 2 years ago. So of course there are various actions. We know the current initiatives, the Digital Compass, the 2030 Digital Compass, the recent governance framework that was announced in September, passed to Digital Decade. And we know also the current regulatory initiatives. We know that during the French presidency, major initiatives were pushed regarding the digital field. So here you have on my slide a list of all those regulations that have been or are being adopted. And I'm sure that I missed some of them on my slide. And one of my questions here is, well, the question that was asked, that was raised at the very beginning of this panel: what are we making the right choices? Could we say that we are over-regulating, that the European region would become separated from the rest of the world, and that our companies would be prevented from growing due to those regulations? And this is something that I would like to ask. And I would also like to highlight the question of data transfers. We know that there is a new negotiation that is taking place with the US for a new privacy shield. But again, are we being too dogmatic in this respect? Should we allow somehow that our data be transferred in the US, and that to a certain extent, the US authority might have access to those data? So again, this is a provocative question, but this needs to be raised. Maybe we have hope, of course, since the EU is currently negotiating with the US in the context of the Trade and Technology Council. But this might be not enough. You mentioned, and Andrea mentioned previously, China, Russia. So here I'm only talking about what's currently going on with the US. So maybe we should, of course, discuss with everyone, but I have to say as a conclusion that I'm a little bit worried about what the EU is doing from a regulatory perspective, because I am wondering, frankly, if we are going maybe too far. We have so many regulations coming at the very same time. Is it that good for us and for our digital economy? So this is the question that I would like to start with.
Okay, thank you, Florence. So you described the situation as mostly the European situation, mostly as a response of the digital environment, right? So now, Johannes, please, the floor is yours. We are still good on time.
I have a problem with sharing my screen, which is surprising. Oh. Yeah, I cannot share it at the moment. That is bad, but it should not be a big problem. I'm just going to speak like that. So I'm mainly referring to an essay of mine about the norm development process of digital sovereignty that I was publishing this year. And there I started with 3 notions of digital sovereignty. So the Chinese one, the Russian one, and the European one. And the Chinese version of digital sovereignty, which is called cyber sovereignty or information sovereignty in China, that is pretty old. That goes back to the 1990s, starts around the year 1997, which is interesting because it has an anti-colonial aspect. You know, that was also the time when Hong Kong was giving back, for example. And so it frames this whole question in terms of anti-colonialism. And on the inside, of course, it involves censorship. And China uses its influence, as already said by Andrea, to promote this issue of digital sovereignty in multilateral fora, for example, at the WSIS, and there in the Tunis agenda of 2005, it is also written down that states should have the sovereign right to regulate cyberspace. That is interesting because Bernard Benamou and Laurent Sorbier, French tech advisors and policy advisors, they are attending this WSIS meeting in 2005, and then they write their first European essay on souveraineté numérique in 2006. So that's just regarding the history of this idea. And in Russia, you have a way more aggressive idea of digital sovereignty than in China. And it goes back to the Duma protests of 2011 and to the Snowden revelations of 2013. And from these dates on, Russia is developing the sovereign internet and heading towards strong localization of data, but also pursuing an overly aggressive international agenda, for example, by the propaganda campaigns 2016, 2017, in the context of Brexit, the US election, and the French election. And this also, what Russia is doing is pushing the EU to exert more internet control. For example, with the French Loi Avia, but also the Loi number 2018-12 on misinformation, and the German NetzDG, which is partly also included in the US Digital Services Act. And that is highly problematic because these laws, for example, were found to be unconstitutional. In France, the Loi Avia was immediately revoked by the Conseil Constitutionnel, and the German NetzDG even inspired authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes all over the world, like Singapore, Russia, Philippines, and Venezuela, that explicitly mentioned the German NetzDG as an inspiration of their legislation. And of course, that's also a problem, as also has been said by Florence, that the overly regulatory approach in Europe is hurting small and medium enterprises who can usually not afford the high compliance costs, while it's big tech from China and the US, they can afford that. Another problematic aspect is that this whole rhetoric of digital colonialism, which is already questionable in China, but at least China is actually a country that has like a experience of colonialism in the past as a victim of colonialism, whilst in Europe has been the active promoter of colonialism. And so it's problematic if European politicians of all people speak about digital colonialism. But one also needs to say that digital sovereignty in the EU is improving, and we see that in the Digital Services Act and in the Digital Markets Act, who then target explicitly large enterprises, for example, as defined in the Digital Markets Act, gatekeepers, and in the Digital Services Act, very large online platforms. Also, which is interesting, in the Digital Markets Act, the principle of interoperability, which is like one of the core principles of the open internet, actually became part of the legislation, in as much as it requires app providers to provide interoperability. We don't see that right now, how it's working out. It might have also a security downside, but that's actually an interesting approach. I think what is most important, the whole talk about digital colonialism is masking the fact that it's not US big tech and it's not the US government that is constituting a problem to Europe's digital sovereignty, but it's rather Europe's lacking investment in infrastructure. And you can see that all over Europe pretty clearly with the fact that, for example, a strong country as Germany has primarily a copper cable infrastructure in terms of internet still, and you can also see that in the fate of the Gaia X project, right? Gaia X was supposed to provide a sovereign cloud infrastructure, but then it included Google, Amazon, and Huawei. And so it was a big question whether that kind of, like, let's say, talk and economic protectionism is actually compatible with the export-driven European interests. And I think that is the core question of digital sovereignty in Europe, to come to the conclusion that Europe's digital industry and Europe's industry overall is primarily export-oriented. And so it can hardly have an interest in promoting any form of economic protectionism, which digital sovereignty might include. That was it from my side.
Okay, Johannes, thank you very much for this overview, which gives more a geopolitical perspective to the debate. So our final speaker today is Mr. Novak. Jaromir, please, the floor is yours, but I want to ask the audience also to start thinking about the questions that should be posted on the chat before we close the session, please. Jaromir.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me in this interesting panel. You know, and you are probably aware that there is the big difference between liberal and restrictive countries in the Council. And everyone obviously projects their own worldview, their own history, and their own policy in what technological sovereignty is. The Czech Republic is part of the digital 9+ countries in the EU, and for us, the technological sovereignty means less dependence, mostly of the critical infrastructure on suppliers from the third countries. So for us, it's not definitely the EU first protections measure. So this idea, in my opinion, could really be very harmful for the next competence of the EU in the future. If we close the doors, we are not able to really focus on the competency from the different regions. Our university prepared a positional research paper, and I can share the link later on. And there is stated, obviously, that in the EU there is currently not a leader in the majority of technical innovations, that closing import of technological advanced products, we are really limiting them in achieving high-tech competitiveness. I think that we as a EU, we were so focusing on waiting for next GSM miracle, so we missed the opportunity for innovations, and it can be seen in the ITU level that the European countries are really cleaning their positions, and they are not focusing on the supporting R&Ds. We are really focusing, we are not able to protect the brain stealing or the unicorn stealing from the EU countries. So this is what we should solve, and not prepare the next regulations. I completely agree with Florence that the regulation of the internet space in 2 or 3 years, it will be totally mess, because there are too many legislations which is now approved on the EU level. So it could be really harmful for small companies who would like to compete with the big tech, but as was said, the big tech can pay for the compliance cost. But the small one, they can't. So we should focus on reducing these barriers and reducing the regulations, because it will definitely change the internet in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaromir. So this is a new perspective, and this is one of the, related to what you were saying, I have one question for the panelists. I see they are not coming on the chat, but I will have one. there are risks on all the policies that are being proposed, risks that may affect the way the internet works. And my question for each of you, do you think European policymakers are fully aware of the risks? So they are putting on the table one after one new regulations. My colleague Callum mentioned before risks that can derive from a bad implementation of projects like the DNS for EU, or a project or a regulation like NIS2 that can have good intentions, but if they are not well implemented, they can have bad consequences for the internet, how consumers perceive it and how the internet works. So what do you think? Are policymakers fully aware? How can we change this? How can we improve it? I'll pass one by one to you so you can have a response to this. Please, Andrea.
I think that I'm going to be a bad speaker, and I'm going to throw this question first to our last speaker, because I think I would like to build from what Novak has to say about this.
Okay, Florence, any opinion on this? No?
You're on mute.
Muted.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I would like to take the example of the AI Act. It has been highlighted that this prospective regulation could include significant constraints for SMEs, and so could be really problematic and inhibiting. But at the same time, I think that all regulators see it as something that would create certain guarantees that could attract customers, that could show that the EU would be a protected market for a certain kind of customers, for certain kind of companies where basic values are respected. And I think it's their idea. So maybe they don't see the side effects, but I think this is the main idea.
Okay, Johannes, please.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting point. Maybe like European legislators also have a wrong idea about digital products because like this high standard, high quality Brussels effects products, they work very well in other domains, for example, regarding cars or machinery. There you want this kind of regulation, right? This kind of high standards. But maybe digital products work differently. That could be one question to ask. And of course, another very obvious point is it is very cheap for European legislators to just regulate and regulate and regulate. And it looks very well in the media and in the press and at the audiences. And it costs almost nothing, for them, immediately. And so I think that's just a very human sense that politicians will tend to act in that way and will like put themselves into the spotlight by being very harsh regulators. It's another question whether that's effective or not.
And Mr. Novak, please, any views on this?
Well, I would like to be diplomatic. I'm not sure that they are able really to focus all consequences that it can be done by the regulations. They are maybe more focusing on the regulations itself and some highlights, but they do not see the details of their steps. And I remember 2009 when we negotiating the final telecom package and the cookies regulation, and it's made me really nightmare for more than 1 week when I see the legislation, preparation of the legislation in the details, which was really not very connected with the real life. And I am quite afraid of the coming regulation concerning blocking of the content, because it could be really harmful. It could be harmful not only for the internet, but also for the trust of the people who are using this infrastructure. So this is, I think, it's not well prepared, it's not well written, and it's not really thinking properly.
Thank you for those views. I think one of the roles that we have as civil society is to give input to policymakers about what they are doing and what is wrong and what is right. And this process here at the EuroDIG will get the opinions of the panelists and the responses to the questions. And we will make a report on this, and this can be used for input to policymakers so that they are fully aware of what civil society thinks and give processes. And this is part of the nature of the European Union as well, listening to stakeholders of all nature. So with that, I want to thank you for your participation. If there are no questions on the chat, I think we are closing the panel even 3 minutes ahead of time, so that can give us 3 minutes of our life back. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for your comments and for your contributions to this discussion.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much for the sessions.